Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Healing the Spirit. In this episode, I'm sharing with you a rich textured transmission on the current Venus Retrograde cycle with the astrologer, diviner, and mystic Suprasensory Shahir. Shahir's a friend of the podcast, and the last time they were here, we had this really beautiful conversation on Jupiter. We discussed some of the archetypal themes that will be highlighted during this cycle, and I, as always, especially appreciated the depth of knowledge as well as the generosity of spirit that Shahir brought into considering astrological transits. So, before we get into the episode, let me just share a couple key dates to situate us. Venus began moving retrograde on March 1st, 2025 at 10 degrees Aries. It will crawl backwards through Aries and re-enters Pisces on March 27th, and Venus will station direct on April 12th, 2025 at 24 degrees Pisces. So a couple things here. This Venus retrograde lasts approximately 6-ish weeks, right? And the other thing to mention is if you have any planets or placements in your chart that is somewhere between 24 degrees Pisces to 10 degrees Aries, that's probably going to be colored in experience through this Venus retrograde. So that's just something to be aware of if you have personal relationship or some sort of skill and mastery around your chart. You may want to check and you may want to see some of these themes that we're talking about may come through in your lived experience. Okay, let's get into it. This is my conversation with Suprasensory Shahir. Hi, Shahir. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, Jonathan. Of course, of course. I'm always here to talk about Venus.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you over. You and I have known each other for years now. We were just talking about it before we started recording. And you're one of the people that came to mind whenever I think about Venus. Like, really, I think you are
Oh my
such an
God.
embodiment of Venus and also the sun, actually. I also think of you and associate you with the sun. So,
Yeah.
um,
Sometimes people do mistaken me as like a Leo. And that like I used to always take a kind of like, no, I'm not a Leo. But now I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's a solar energy.
Yeah, you have big solar energy for sure. And I've just really loved seeing your creativity, your insights. You're also a fellow Gemini moon. So I'm always surprised when I read what you write or what you share on social
Hmm.
media or in other places. You have this way about you that is just so gracious and so expansive as a Sag rising, right? Am I remembering
Yeah.
that correctly? Okay,
Thank
yeah.
you. Yes,
Um,
yes.
I always think of you in that expansive state and also just very illuminating and graceful. And so I thought, so we had been in conversation, and then you floated the idea of coming in to talk about Venus retrograde, this particular cycle. And that felt like 1,000% resonant yes for me. So here we are talking about
Here we
Venus.
are. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for saying yes to that too. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So I want to begin just opening up a general space for you to talk a little bit about yourself, to talk a little bit about your practice as an astrologer and diviner and other roles that you're currently holding. And also, if it feels aligned, something I wanted to hear you talk about was this idea of being a love devotee that you have practiced for
Mm,
years. Like I've seen you
yeah.
use that term in your handle and in various places where you talk about your practice. And yeah, I wanna hear all about it.
Yeah, oh my God. Yes, of course. So to everyone's listening, this is my second time here, right?
Yes,
On the
yes.
pod with you, which is so interesting that we did the Jupiter in Aries one last time, and now we're
Yeah.
kind of like talking about Aries again, but this is like it's almost like the switching of the benefics that we're doing. Like, we're talking about Jupiter last time and Venus this time. Which is, even for my own chart, it made sense. I have Jupiter in Libra, and so that's probably why
Mm,
being a love devotee makes sense for me. But it really came about through um the lens of truly being devoted to love kind of like idea, because I even put in my profile, I just put it like love is God is love, kind of just
mm,
like that sort of like love is God it's love is part of my process of like integrating love deeper into my spirituality and spiritual praxis, back in the days when I was sort of like struggling with like my queer identity, with like my own religious loving, side. I love being a Muslim, and I love the certain religious practices. And then I discovered Sufism, which definitely aligns more with this sort of like idea of like divine love is human love is unconditional love. It's like, the merging of everything, which is sort of like very Piscean in a way. And we
yes.
can think about that actually, as I always like to throw back the question of like, whenever we, for example, we think about the planets, um, like why Venus exalts in Pisces, right? Why is
Mhm.
that so, right? It's
Yeah.
because of like how all encompassing love is, and how divine it is as well. I mean, Pisces is the most, I would definitely, I would stand behind this statement. I was like, Pisces is the most benefic of signs, as in it is the place of Jupiter and the exaltation place of Venus. Um, and so I was like really thinking about that. But yeah, so to backtrack a bit, I show up as Suprasensory Shahir, right? And that is, I'm an astrologer. I used to do tarot a lot, but now I've kind of like integrated tarot and astrology together more so in a
Mm,
very like Gemini moon kind of way.
mhm.
Um, Recently I'm also going to be showing up as a 13th reader for our beloved Britton LaRue's The Magician's Table, which is so interesting and how that dynamic came about. I mean, you were the first 13th reader,
That's
right, and I
true.
really wanted to be in the cohort when you were there. And then I sort of like, and then I entered soft strength, but that's such an interesting story and manifestation, and how sort of like
Mm,
sometimes you put desire on a shelf and then you
yeah.
just, all right, like when's the time for it, and then that's sort of like the Saturnian knowing.
Mm,
um but yeah, so that's sort of like how my path is about. It has a lot to do with reckoning with my own identity, partly
mm.
so. And I remember learning astrology deeper with you in Sabrina Monarch Scarce, although
Yeah.
before that I've been learning it like, um on my own. But then I remember how the class with Sabrina was truly transformative for me to
Mm,
be confident in my craft, I would say.
yeah.
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 And then we did the Venus embodiment series together. Maybe
That's
probably that's
true.
also why. Yeah, and you were my guest.
Yes, I
Yeah, that
remember
that
that.
yeah, the Venus embodiment YouTube episode. Yeah, that's just been sitting there, and I sort of like, sometimes people come in and watch it and put a
Mm,
comment in it for some of the videos. And yeah, I think that was the year where I truly sort of like, all right, let me just be a student and like be, you know practicing the Venus stuff, and I was truly making videos almost every month when Venus was traversing different signs. And
Mm,
those videos are still up there on YouTube if anyone want to check out. But yeah, I show up as a human being in my life, as a as a chill as a child of the cosmos in some ways, to my parents also. And I'm home now to sort of like help my parents out. And yeah, that's kind of like what I am today.
yeah.
Um, and I just enjoy doing divination. Like I I don't know why, like I enjoy the various crafts that I recently picked up runes as well, and geomancy.
Mm,
Oh my god, I love geomancy now. But yeah,
mhm.
so that's like I'm a very mutable like diviner, I would say too. Although I
Yeah.
don't like practice it with a client as my own personal praxis, I
Mm.
do have I do love a variety of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. That is so rich. I will definitely link to the Venus embodiment series on your YouTube.
Yeah,
So,
there's a playlist. Yeah, so anyone
yeah.
can check out their own Venus signs. Yeah, that was a
Yes.
really fun one. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You really opened me up, actually. That conversation we had, you really helped me open up to my Venus in Aquarius nature, because to me, it
Mm.
almost feels like the Venus in Aquarius nature is the part of my chart that was the least visible to me. But it's
Ah.
interesting also, like in my own journey with Venus, the deeper I am into my professional practice, especially when I'm thinking about my aesthetics or how I like to show up, the more I see my Venus in Aquarius. But yeah, that conversation with you was such an initiation and an invitation, Shahir, because there was a part of me that was like, "What? Shahir sees my Venus nature?" Like I was kind of confused. I was like, "Okay, I guess we'll talk about
You can
it."
say you're an artist, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's true. You're so right. You're so right. And I think that Venus in Aquarius in my sixth house, ruled by Saturn in Aquarius, can sometimes get a little bit lost in the artist
Mm.
studio, right? Like it's so
Yeah.
busy refining its craft that it sometimes doesn't see its own nature, I suppose.
Oh my
So
God, I
you
love
help
that.
her come out of the woodwork a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, and I think and I think that is something Venusian as a
Mm,
quality too, right?
mm,
Venus is about connecting all the parts of us in a way, essentially, right?
mm,
Including those that
mm.
which are hidden. And so
Yeah.
that's why um in ancient kind of like understanding of Venus too, or in certain framings of it, it is the connector planet,
Mhm,
thinking about it as the ruler of like Libra, which sort of like seeks to connect, but it's also like the Pisces that sort of like seeks to be inclusive, right? In a lot of
mm.
ways. So yeah, Venus is, I always see Venus as this sort of like a how in astrology we call it like the lesser benefic, but
Yeah.
I've been using this term. I call Venus the intimate benefic.
Mm.
Yeah, so Jupiter is the greater benefic. Yes, I mean I let that sort of like, okay, let that sit there. But then I like, yes, Jupiter is the greater benefic, but Venus is the intimate benefic. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
Would you say more about that? I'm curious to
yeah,
hear your
yeah. It's
relationship with that word, intimate. Yeah.
yeah. It's sort of like, because Venus does rule for me. The way I see Venus is like it really does rule the things which are more perhaps tactile in life, right?
Yeah.
In a more visceral slash physical sort of way, right? We might think about um relationships as, another person, as a true Libra, right? We think about Taurus as our own body and our own senses, right? It's very intimate to us, right? I mean, Taurus is also the place where the moon is rejoicing and the moon is exalted, right? So you might also think about like how Venus exalts the moon, and that is
Yeah.
such an intimate thing, right? Like for Venus to sort of like, all right, yeah, like the place of Taurus is where the moon is sort of like the VIP, or like, the the higher ranking there in terms of like the idea of like exaltation lord.
Mm.
Um in some ways. So yeah, it is very personalized in a lot of ways. So that's why I call it intimate. And intimacy is also something that is very quote unquote like godly, right? Or sort of like this forces that connects us with something more than just
Mm.
us, right? And so it's sort of like,
Mm.
and that is why Venus is also exalted in Pisces kind of like idea where Jupiter then exalts Venus. So I always, that's why I was like, oh yeah, this is so interesting. Like Venus exalts Saturn in Libra, right? And then Venus also like Venus is the only sign, if I'm not mistaken. Um, I mean, yeah, I mean the only planet with dual rulership, I would say, like, I mean, because the
Mm.
moon also exalts Jupiter. Like, but
Yeah.
Venus is the only places like Libra and Taurus
Hmm.
are both places which has exaltation, if you want to think about
Yes.
it, right? And so
Yes.
it's sort of like compared to Saturn exalts Mars in
Hmm.
Capricorn, but nothing in Aquarius, right? I
Hmm.
mean, Jupiter exalts Pisces only, nothing is exalted in
In
Sagittarius, right?
Sagittarius.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
Mars is also like exalts the sun
Mm. In
in
Aries.
the Aries and not in Scorpio, nothing in Scorpio,
Mm.
right? But
Hmm.
Venus is the only one that, at least those with two houses, that has this sort of like, and even if you think of like the sun and moon as like
Yeah.
luminary too, right? As like a one entity, as like a, if you quote the sun and moon as a luminary, nothing exalts in Leo, right? But something exalts in Cancer, right? But then Venus has
Mm.
this sort of like special thing where, oh yeah, both of my Libra and my Taurus houses actually has exaltation. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so I see almost sort of like exaltation can be looked at as almost like even the planet that is ruling that place is actually almost giving like a special special card, or like, like a special energy to
Yeah.
whatever that planet is subscribed to. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
why I came into this idea of like the intimate benefic, where
Mm.
it's sort of like it makes things like, oh yeah, like you belong here, or like there's a sense of belonging and inclusivity. Yes, it's also a sense of like impact as well, to yeah,
Mm.
internally and externally. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. Belonging and impact. I love that. I got full body chills hearing you talk about Venus as ruling the only two places, or being the only planetary ruler where both lands are exalted, or have
Mm.
planets exalted in them. Um, and I think that really kind of, it's interesting because the word generous is often associated with Jupiter, but I do think that there is a certain quality of generosity to Venus that we can kind of feel into, you know?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a generosity to that as well.
Yeah.
Um, for sure. And because, and I do think it's like it's true, our sense of like relationships, and yeah, like when we feel good, like it's almost like we also like permeate that sort of like goodness kind of like idea kind of feeling too.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's sort of like this sort of like idea of Venus being generous and helping, and yeah, and things like that. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about. And I was also thinking about like somehow like, I've been studying Jyotish for a bit as well.
Mm.
um in Jyotish, in Indic astrology, Vedic astrology, people look at, it's still Venus and Jupiter as the benefics.
Mm.
And there's always this idea that like Venus is actually the teacher. It's like,
Mm.
it's almost like a, Jupiter is the teacher of the heavenly, and then Venus is like the teacher of the underworldly, you know? And so,
Mm.
but then, I don't want the people to get into, oh my God, like underworld, is it hell or whatever? Or like, but in a way, but like in their own imagery, there is no idea of like this demon or whatever have you, right? But like,
Yeah.
it's kind of like the idea of like whatever that is earthed, or whatever that is more um intimate too, like it's more real in terms of like our human senses. um
Mm.
and so that's why Venus is sort of like the teacher. Shukracharya is sort of like the teacher of the demons, quote unquote, the idea.
Mm.
And that's something there's something interesting there in terms of like Venus being important
Yeah.
to whatever that is like around us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Before we talk about this current Venus retrograde period we're in, there was a curiosity that I had when you spoke about starting your Venus embodiment project. Was there a specific impetus, Shahir, for you? Was there like a particular moment that made you want to develop a deeper relationship with Venus, or was it a desire that built up over time?
Yeah, it was definitely a desire that built up over time.
Mm.
Because I learned to work intimately more with Venus when I got into astrology because I went into it of like, oh my God, my Venus is busted. It's like, she's exile, so I would, yeah, it's a, when you first learn astrology and you learn like your Venus is in detriment, and you're like, oh, is my love life fucked or what? I mean, yes, in some ways it's true. But like I would just like but that's also not true, right? It's so like there's this interesting dynamic of where I was inviting Venus and talking about the cycles now too. It's so interesting that there is this sort of like the idea of the 8-year cycle of Venus, right? And so every
Yeah.
8 years, Venus will sort of have the interior, or even some people use a superior conjunction, but
Mm.
I use the interior conjunction as the new quote unquote new Venus. It will come back to the same point every 8 years. It only moves by like 1 degree or so. And actually, yeah, it's actually 8 years ago was when I truly realize that I want to be in relationship. Yeah.
Mm.
It's so
Wow.
interesting. Yeah, it was only in 2017. And that year wasn't a year that it wasn't really a year that I had any spiritual inklings, whatever. I had my own spiritual journey even before that, but like I only accelerated more in 2019. But yeah, 2017 was really Venusian in the ways of like realization that, oh yeah, this is something I wanted. And I was like,
Mm.
I've been denying it for myself because of a list of things like being queer, being Muslim, whatever, and being in a
Mm.
society, like feeling a bit like, there's like a lot of like that sense of like self-judgment, but
Mm.
also being fed by like the societal kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that Venus embodiment was primarily coming forth from the place of like wanting to get closer to Venus. And so yeah, I started with, planetary devotion primarily, 2019, and then and up to that point in yeah, my birthday year in 2022. Yeah, so 2022 was the year I started the project, just because I was also in a year that I was in my Taurus perfection year. So I was like,
Mm.
hey, this is a wonderful year because I've never had Venus since my, I went into my spiritual awakening things with Saturn as my lord, right? I'm like, which has its beauty on its own, but like that was almost my, okay, this is the first perfection year that I am truly immersed in this
Mm.
esoteric arts, astrology, and all these things. And I was like, let's visualize it into making the Venus embodiment series. And actually, that year
Beautiful.
I got Venus in Aquarius as my Venus.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, solar return Venus. Yeah, my solar return Venus. Yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
Nice. Wow. I love hearing about this. So I'm curious, Shahir, what's on your mind and what's in your heart when you're thinking about this Venus retrograde cycle that we're in?
Yeah, I think this Venus retrograde is doing a lot of stuff.
Mm.
Yeah, if you go online, and a lot of people even on YouTube are talking about it, all the great YouTube astrologers would say,
Yeah.
like astrologers are also like talking about this Venus. Um, but one of my favorite resource person for Venus retrograde or Venus things in general is Palace K. Augustine. Do you know
Mhm.
Palace? Oh my God.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm gonna pitch it here. If anyone's listening, go and grab the Venus retrograde guidebook, dream
Mm.
book, workbook, playbook, something like whatever book. It's
Yeah.
it's it's great. It's a great resource. I've been a follower of like Palace's guidebooks, workbooks for a while now.
Mm.
and that has always been immense. And I love our friendship so much. But yeah, so thinking about this Venus retrograde, um, I was really thinking about it as sort of like this integration, right, of the fire and the water, right?
Mm.
Obviously, we're thinking about the place of Aries
Mhm.
and the place of Pisces that is getting that sort of like integration. And the thing about retrograde Venus, which I have always known it to be true, is that it is a time when the interiority of life becoming louder, right?
Mm.
It's sort of like there's a resonance between retrogrades and the focus on the interiority of life. Like the interior parts of our life are getting shaken a bit. And that's why I think fundamentally people are always afraid a bit of Venus retrograde in general, and that's where perhaps the word would be like this, the trying to discern of like, yes, in a mundane way for some, for certain things it might, as always with astrology, right, there's always like the good, the quote unquote good, or the bad sort of like manifestation of whatever have you, right?
Mm.
But then in a more personalized sort of like transit sort of way, it's always sort of like this reckoning with the interior parts of ourself, essentially. Like Venus retrograde is a time where whatever that is internal
Mm.
are screaming louder. I
Yeah.
would say it's like, oh my God, like I have this desire. Where is this coming from?
Mm.
Um, and and that is the work of the Venus retrograde, even for all phases, right? Regardless of whatever position Venus is in the sky, right? Venus retrogrades every I forgot there's a true number of days, 500 something something, right?
Mm.
It's 1 in almost 2 years. I would always say it's almost 2 years. Every almost 2 years, Venus would retrograde.
Yeah.
The last time Venus was retrograding was when she was in Leo, right?
Leo.
She was
Yeah.
fully in Leo. She was in that part of the sky. So that's the last time was around August, right? Like,
Mm.
was it, yeah, August of 2023, right? So
Mm.
then now we're here 1 year and a half ish plus later, with another retrograde. So yeah, like it's always sort of like, for me it is a time when there is this sort of like focus on the interiority of life, and then see how that will integrate it, right? And that's why,
Mm.
Venus is the ruler of like relationship and love and values, and what you value, what you value is getting re-evaluated,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
And that's a deep work, right? It's kind of like, it's it can feel difficult too for some people, and that's why I'm not trying to like dismiss the experience of like the heart, like the difficulty of Venus
Yeah.
retrograde, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? How have you been thinking about Venus retrograde usually? Is there any particular things that stood out for you?
Yeah. So much here. I think what you just offered up to us is extremely rich. I really like what you were saying about reevaluation of values because for me, at least, the last Venus retrograde that I was observing, that Venus retrograde in Leo, was really showing me about what my values are in terms of my habits or in terms of my
Mm.
um my actions, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that intensification, right, of the volume of our internal experience in light of perhaps an external experience that's a little bit surprising to us, and
Mm.
for me, for example, like I was really keenly aware at that time of how I was saying something about these are the things I value. For example, specifically at that moment, I was exploring the idea of relationship anarchy. And not just
Mm.
relationship anarchy in the context of polyamory necessarily, but in the
Mm-hmm.
context of really evaluating and valuing my relationships from like as its own unit. So I was
Mm.
thinking specifically at that time about my relationship with my partner and um, where have I taken on values from the overculture or taken on values from maybe even comparing our relationship to other couples, that is
Mm.
actually really not in service to how I want to relate with my partner, you know? And
Yeah.
that was really crunchy, Shahir, because it
Yeah, it
was
is hard.
right. Because like here's,
Yeah.
and especially as a Venus and Aquarius, here's this idea, relationship anarchy, that looks so amazing and seems so aligned with my intellect, right? But then I could see all the ways that I wasn't living it out in terms of how I was
Mm.
talking to my partner, in terms of how I was um, interacting with my partner in the context of our larger friend group, And so,
I see.
yeah, it was a time when I think the other thing I should mention about Venus retrograde too is I've personally experienced loneliness coming up as a
Mm.
theme with Venus
Yeah.
retrograde. Like,
Yeah.
the values that we hold can sometimes set us apart from the world around us, right? And so
Yeah.
as you're speaking, you said reckoning with the interior part. That word reckoning really landed and resonated with me because I experienced a lot of loneliness actually. And that loneliness
Mm.
wasn't even external. Like I had people
Yeah.
around me, but internally I was like, "Oh, I'm exploring something, like a desire maybe in my case with the Venus retrograde in Leo last time, it was like a desire to be more in alignment with the values that matter to me. But
Mm-hmm.
that requires me to do the kind of work that I can't really um at that time I didn't know how to engage my community in the work. Like it's almost like I
Yeah.
had to do my own work first and
First.
then I bring it out into the larger community. And I will say the last thing I'll say is that a lot of that work, Shahir, as you're talking, I'm reflecting on how that's played such an important role in terms of like that Venus retrograde really shifted how I related to the people around me. So it wasn't just my
Yeah.
partner. Like my partner and my relationship with my partner was kind of the entry point, right? It was the mouth
Yeah.
of the lion, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then um yeah, over time it carried over and um began to transform other relationships I have in my life.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. And yeah, there is an interesting connection of this time around to that Venus in Leo because when Venus was in Leo, I mean obviously the skies were different, yada yada. I mean I was having a great time, but I was traveling during that time. And so yeah, that's the other thing, right? But I want to put a pin on the idea of like the loneliness, which is
Mm,
yeah, I had a thought about that. Because the reason why the Venus retrograde, this is more the traditional part of me that's coming out, right? Like the traditional astrology is like planets, especially benefics, whenever they are in retrograde, it almost as if that planet is withdrawing. There is a
mm,
sense of like reversal,
yeah.
right? And so that's why people say like, and then I know like to each of its own. People say don't start relationship during Venus retrograde. Oh blah 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 blah. Your ex are coming back. I'm like I'm not here to critique all of that. Like for some people's life, maybe Venus is super important in terms of their placement, maybe as the Lord of their seventh, whatever
Mm,
have you, that and that happens, right? Through the
yeah.
magic of their birth chart. But like the ancient idea of retrograde, it's always, especially if it's benefic, it is about the planetary becoming less external, basically, because direct
Mm,
has a lot to do with like externalization, right?
yeah.
But then retrograde is about the sort of like the collapsing of the direct, right? It's almost like
Mm,
all right, I'm withdrawing, and that's why that's why the loneliness kind of feeling, it sort of like creates a space for loneliness almost, right? It's almost like
yeah.
all right, we're not going there. We're going inside out. It's like it's almost like you're having to going like having to clean up like something internal kind of
Mm,
feeling or like really reviewing in a lot of ways.
mm,
Yeah, and so in ancient times, people have, which is still sort of like we can see it happening, right? Like it is when the planet sort of like withdraws certain influences, I would say, right? So it's like we're thinking about Venus, like Venus is like reviewing or like it's withdrawing certain thing. And also there's also a nature of it being like almost like a reverse, right? It's almost like, oh, you want that in your relationship? All right, you have to like put up a mirror and look at yourself first, kind of
Yeah.
feeling. And you're just like, oh my God, I'm getting exposed now, right?
Yes.
and and that is why I do think that Venus retrograde, especially, is a beautiful time for like shadow work and like
Yeah.
inner work or whatever have you, right? Sort of like that focus on that interior aspect, which sounded like what you were doing too, right? With like the Venus and Leo one. Um, and so yeah, and even in this Aries one, what I've been tuning into is that like it's really how we like advocate for ourselves,
Mm.
essentially, right? It
Mhm.
is about like how um brave or audacious we are with certain desires of like, oh yeah, like I can and that can sometimes feel a bit like, and this is also the other thing with retrograde benefic. It's almost like, you know how, uh I forgot their name, Peter Ferry or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was this one time Peter Ferry, I think they were talking about like how like the frequencies and the internal and the external, right? And so like that's
Mhm.
how we sort of like operate in life of like,
Yeah.
all right, we want the internal to sort of like vibrate with the external,
Yes.
right? But then I do think that whenever Venus retrograde comes about, there's something about like there's a focus more on the internal aspect before the transference to the external,
Mm.
right? So
Mm.
meaning that like it is about the magnetization, it is about like the pulling in of whatever energy, but it's more about like figuring the balance out for yourself first, right? Which is
Mm.
sort of very Aries too. Right now, it's like figure it
Yeah.
out for yourself and and see what you have there, kind of like, and that can create all sort of feelings, right? When we're
Yeah.
doing that sort of like work. And yeah, I do think I wouldn't say like I'm skilled at it, but like as a I have retrograde Venus, so that's why I wanted to come in as well. So I was like, oh yeah, like maybe this is my specialist era. It's like
Yeah.
this is what I was born to do. This is my life.
Yes.
It's like this retrograde Venus is my life, right? And I never knew how special that is.
Mm.
Because I at first I paid less attention to like the R. When you see it as like R, you're just like, what is that? Like,
Yeah.
oh, maybe it's just a code thing. And then there's this one time I thought that the benefics are labeled R because I have both benefics in retrograde. And when I
Oh,
first like,
wow.
very newbie astrologer, like
Yeah.
generating my own chart. I mean, astro enthusiast, I would say at that time, I was like, oh, why there's an R at this planet? And I was like, oh, maybe there's something. Oh, maybe it's because it's a special planet. And I knew it was that. But then, yeah, so as a person with like both benefics and retrograde, I've also seen how like the idea of like withdrawal
Mm.
within, and there's always a focus on the interior is important. And yeah, and certain things might not sort of like happen the way you sort of like want it to be and things like that. I mean, but that's sort of like life, in
That's
in
sort
in
of
a way
life.
too. It
Exactly.
doesn't mean that you have to have certain planets. It's just sort of like yeah, there's always about like balancing the interior and the exterior parts of life, and having it being in resonance. So yeah, the interesting thing about this Venus retrograde um is that it's going to go from Aries to Pisces, right?
Mm.
And so it's almost like Venus going from exile to exaltation, and I was like, oh my god, I
Yeah.
love this. I think
Yeah.
this is like one of those beautiful places to even think about the sort of like the exiled parts of yourself, right?
Mm.
And I've been seeing that this being talked about in the collective and around me as well. It's almost as if this exiled Venus is almost like, yeah, like really questioning what you don't have, and
Mm.
how are you trying to go and have it in a way too. Like it's almost like if it's like sort of like exiled planets are always equated to a sense of lacking resource, or it's I always like to view it as more like Venus is in her antithesis, right? She's in the opposite place. So she's a stranger, right?
Mm.
And how does it feel like to be a stranger?
Yeah.
Um, on one hand, it's still a martial, so it's like you still have to fight for yourself, like um you still have to advocate for yourself regardless of wherever you are, right? And so this is where like the point of Venus retrograde really, brings up in us this kind of like, okay, what are we fighting for? Like, what are we
Mm.
sort of like, what are the values that we're fighting for? And I think
Mm.
with the current landscape of the world, politics and whatever have you, I think we're all sort of like reckoning with that. I'm like, oh my God, these people are doing all these things. And
Yeah.
then what is it that I am here to truly fight for myself,
Mm.
right?
Right. Right.
And that's where the Aries part come in because it's inherently martial, Martian, in multiple ways, right? It is about Venus is having the tools of Mars, and then it's like having to go inside and kind of just like figuring it out.
Mm.
And then it will transition into Pisces in the later parts of it. But the conjunction is happening still in Aries. So I think the conjunction is happening, the Venus Cazimi is happening around 2 degrees of
Yeah.
Aries, right? And that is the point where it's sort of like the Venus is changing from an evening star to a morning star. And then majority of the morning star
Yeah.
parts is in Pisces until like
Mm.
24 degrees of Pisces. It will
Mhm.
station direct. And so yeah, I've been really kind of like floating with that. All right, what is it that internally I kind of like one, and maybe in Pisces I might let it go, right? Or I might get it. It's like it is
Mm.
exalted Venus, right? Exaltation Venus is the
Yeah.
fruition of whatever Venus is, that whatever it is sort of like desiring in a way too. So yeah, there's a lot of
Mm.
like reckoning of that. In the Pisces part of Venus is also where it's almost like I've been also thinking about this Venus as through the lens of sacrifice in a lot of
Mm.
ways.
Mm.
What are we sort of like sacrificing in order to like achieve certain things? And I
Yeah.
and there's something else with this Venus because I've been learning the lunar mansion a lot,
Mhm.
the nakshatras especially. Venus is going to go through a very spiritual nakshatras in the Indic system, in the Vedic system. These two, so Venus, this is a kind of funny thing because if you follow sidereal astrology, sidereal, okay, I always don't know how to say it. It's like,
Yeah, this sidereal.
but if you follow the other zodiac, Venus is actually fully in Pisces throughout this retrograde. And so it's
Mm.
actually like, all my geotish friends are all like, oh yeah, Venus is retrograde in her exaltation. Venus is retrograde in her exaltation. And I'm like, oh wow. And um I don't really follow that, but I follow the more sort of idea of the nakshatras that the lunar mansion that Venus is going through. And the
Mm.
two nakshatras that Venus is going back and forth is very spiritual. It is the Uttara Bhadrapada nakshatra. So Uttara Bhadrapada has a lot to do with um, this idea of what, like maybe that would be a question that will come about through this retrograde is like, yeah, what is the foundation in which you are living by,
Mm.
right? Because
Mhm.
Uttara Bhadrapada has a lot, it is a very mystical nakshatra that has a lot to do with this sort of like idea of what are the essence of something. And
Mm.
so it actually is related to the nakshatra before that. So there's a nakshatra before that is Purva Bhadrapada, which is like the direct translation is actually interesting. It refers to the funeral kind of like cot or idea of like the funeral bed or something like that. Um, which is sort of like it evokes this sense of death, right?
Mm.
But it's more about like idea when okay, when you die, right? We're going to like this almost a Saturnian place here. Like
Yeah.
when you die, what is the essence that is left within your spirit, right? And
Mm.
that essence then become the foundation of who you are,
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
right? And so we can see that mirroring of that nakshatra wisdom as sort of like, yeah, like what is it that once you've like done this sacrificial rites, kind of like into the different parts of ourselves, which I love, and that's why I embrace Sufism in a lot of ways too, because there's always this conversations about like the inner selves, right? I mean,
Mm.
even in other like a more other spiritual teachings or more like psychological framings of things also have that, right? But there's always this sort of like the idea of like the nafs, the desire, the sort of like the levels of the inner selves and things like that. And it's really about like what is the essence of that once you like sort of like burn it, like this
Mm.
idea of like you're burning your sacrifice, for example, to the gods or for whatever ritual. What is the essence that is left, right? And so there's something about this Venus movement through this nakshatras. This both of this nakshatra has a lot to do with that. It's
Mm.
actually about like ascension, but also about grounding. It's like at
Yeah.
the end of the day, what is it that grounds you in this world, essentially?
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, to those who listening, like I might feel that this part of the ask or like part of the invitations, right, of this Venus retrograde, where it is really sort of like it asks you to go deep because the idea, and so I love about Vedic nakshatra is like um every nakshatra has a deity that presides over it. And for Uttara Bhadrapada, it is Ahirbudnya. Ahirbudnya is sort of like the serpent that sort of like coiling beneath the worlds, right? And you can see that as almost like the idea of like Kundalini or the idea of like
Mm-hmm.
this sort of like the base, the root chakra, right? There's like the Kundalini energy, whatever have you. And sort of like, but this one is referring to the earth, and that is essentially to sort of like to stabilize your sense of spirituality and your sense of earthly as well. So it's like what are the forces that stabilizes you into this world? And I think part of those things that we are being quote unquote stabilized by is through our desires, right? Through our
Mm.
need for like this sort of like Venusian sort of like things
Mm-hmm.
in life. So yeah, that's sort of like the nakshatra that primarily Venus is sort of like traversing through her retrograde. Yeah, do you have any
Wow.
thoughts and feelings about that?
Yeah, thank you. All of that is so, so rich here. A few things caught my attention. Um, I think earlier you mentioned Venus and Aries being about like what are we fighting for, right? And
Mm,
something I was sensing into when you asked that question was also, like why are we fighting for something, right? Like thinking about
yeah.
retrograde also as this moment of reflection, like is the fight that we are putting up, is that in alignment with what
Yes.
we say we value, right? And then you said fruition of the desiring for or something like that when you were talking about Venus and Pisces, and I thought that was such a beautiful way to think about it. And earlier I think it was mirrored in when you were talking about the nakshatra, it was mirrored in this idea of kind of like ascension but also at the same time grounding, right? Or like this
Yeah.
ascension that is facilitated by shedding some of the layers that keeps you heavy in like not a good way. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like it's kind of like
Yeah.
shedding the unnecessary attachments, right? Um yeah, I really also love, I don't know what it is, but when you evoked the serpent imagery, that really resonated with me. Like I'm not computing it in my head, and
Yeah.
maybe you can draw the connection, but there's something about that serpentine quality that also feels very Venusian to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, like it is, if we think about Venus as like the holder of like that connects things, right? It's sort of like
Mm.
the idea of like Ahir Budnya, you know, in Vedic teaching, it is actually that it keeps the world as it is, kind of like idea. It's
Mm.
like
Mm.
it holds the world. It's kind of
Ah.
like if not, we have torn apart kind of feeling,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of like the idea of like we would break, we were like Mars,
Yeah.
kind of like we would break if there's no that coil, that the base of the coil, um, that is sort of like sitting there. Yeah. And the gift of that is the gift of abundance. It is about the
Mm,
gift of rain. And so there's the reason why they're called like this sort of certain nakshatras in lunar mansion in the Vedic astrology, they all of it are in continuum with each other, but certain pairings are more so. That's why you have like Purva and Uttara. Purva is just like the initial part, and the later part.
mm,
Um, and so there's this idea of, for example, whenever you're doing a sacrifice, right? Whenever you're doing a like a petition or prayer, or even like a simple prayer, right? Um, you are like sort of like you have to give up something, right? And that is
mm.
about like going back to the simplest form of like habits too, right? It's
Yeah.
almost like if we want to change ourselves, like we have to change our habits and the things of like
Mm,
the heavy attachment to things. Like yeah, like I for example, like for me, in a very fifth house Venus retrograde, and I'm putting myself a bit on the spotlight here. Like I'm having like suddenly there's a re-emergence of like a crush or like an infatuations in my life, and I'm like, oh my god, the timing of it all.
of course.
Of course, and that's what I was talking about, and that's why when I started I was like, I think Venus wants me to share this part of me a bit, right? And
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it is the fifth house. It's like it's the fifth house
Yeah.
of romance and play and all of those things as well. And yeah, it's when and sometimes this is also like a very retrograde kind of feeling too. Like, okay, when you're being confronted with a desire, like what do you do? Like, what do you do?
Mm,
Like, what do you do when
mhm.
you, and I guess it's like when you're being like, it's almost like Aries, kind of like very in your face kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the desire is like, hello, I'm here. And it's sort of like it creates this like other sort of like reaction or like responses within you, right? In a very multiple ways, right?
Yeah.
There's an excitement, there's fear, there's like, oh my god, I want to run away from this. Like, oh, okay, I'm not gonna embrace this. This is just a distraction, whatever have you, or like blah blah blah. It's like, all right, yeah, like sit with that a bit longer. It's
Mhm.
okay. You'll figure it out. Like,
Yeah.
and I think, um, yeah, and I think that feels very confronting, right?
Mm,
Desires can, and I think that's very Venus and Aries too. Like desire can feel like a confrontation almost, right?
yeah.
It's sort of like it's the
Yeah.
house of Mars.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, it's there. What are you gonna do about it?
Yes.
And yeah, that is what is emerging for me. Yeah, and then like, from and it reminded me a bit of like the lover's card in the tarot,
Mm,
right? And it's
mhm.
sort of like the idea of the lover's card is sort of like, oh, there's this sort of like the other, or like whatever energy is, and we're being sort of like seeing that, but that is also places where inside of us which are perhaps dormant, or like are, and that's why like you have to go inside as well. Like you're sort of like, okay, what parts of you that is trying to mirror that, or whatever you value, and that is something you want or not
Mm.
want, or yeah, it's like part of the tension, I would also call it, right? It's a place of like,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that word tension is really evocative, I think. And you're also reminding me, Shahir, of how desire, I think, in like when I feel into the energetics of desire, desire feels very thick to me. Like there's kind of a
Mm.
thickness to desire. Um there's a gravity, there's a pull, and also it kind of drags you with it, right? Like there's kind
Yeah.
of a velocity to it too. Um and thinking about Venus and Aries, I do think that Venus and Aries comes in with that force, right? And
Yeah.
so um the question is always, I feel like with Venus and Aries, it's like, do you want to be led by it or do you want to do something else? Do you want to dance with
Mm,
it in a different way, right? And
yeah.
either way, you're going to learn something about yourself. And um, yeah, I think when I think also about like Venus being, slightly under-resourced or maybe more neutrally like differently resourced in
Yeah.
Aries, right?
Different.
Like
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
not having the resource that Venus necessarily prefers. There's a quality here too of like, I don't know, I always think about exiled planets as um have you ever watched that TV show, Shahir, Project Runway?
Oh yeah.
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 You know how like there's the unconventional materials challenge in Project Runway? I
Yeah.
feel like that is
Exactly.
so Venus and Aries. Like like you have to like use all this trash, or like these plastic bottles to make something really beautiful, and to put it down the
Yeah.
runway, right? And um it also makes me think about how, I'm creating a connection here between resources, desires, value, and creativity, right?
Yeah.
Which are
Creative. Yeah.
all kind of Venusian words in some ways, but we can think about Venus and Aries as this place of like, differently resourcedness that forces Venus to be more creative with
Yes.
how to achieve the Venusian agenda, right? Of
Yeah.
harmony, of connection, of love, of ecstasy, even, shall we say. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Venus does rule the ecstatic. Yeah, no, my
Hmm.
God, I love that. I love that. And thinking about the rulers too, right, of Venus and Aries, is like it's going to always be um Mars, which is still in Cancer. Mars is also fallen, which is so like
Oh, it's such
I'm
a
like,
such a trip.
it's such a trip, and like it's not like, and they're not gonna perfect any relationship, as in like I mean they're gonna have a relationship again when Venus gets into Pisces, right? So it's so interesting where it's almost like, okay, this is a funny download I'm getting. It's like Venus is in Aries, and then Venus is like, all right, Mars, like, where are the things? And then Mars is kind of like, I'm in my own zone. I'm like in this Cancerian place, not the best place for me to be. And like the fact that they don't have any aspects to each other. I mean, it is a
Mm,
square by um
sign.
sign, but they're not like
Yeah.
perfecting because Mars is all the way in 17 and going forward
Mm,
already, kind of like leaving Venus behind. And like Venus is like, all right, I'm going back. And so it's so interesting where it's almost as if like actually with this transit, like Venus will be in the place of Mars, and then Venus will go into her exaltation place, and then she would actually be the one that is trining Mars. And
mm,
I find that so like revelatory in sort of like idea of like resource of a planet, even, right? It's almost
mm,
like Venus going in her exile, she only has the sun. When the sun moves into Aries, perhaps that's like the solar influence would help it,
yeah.
because the sun will get exalted in Aries, so
Yeah.
there's something there. Or like, although Venus is burning, and that's a different kind of like idea altogether as well. But yeah, there's something interesting about like the domicile lord of like Mars, being in Cancer, being fallen, and yet when Venus gets into her exaltation, she will actually do a trine with Mars. So
Mm,
there's already been a trine from Venus in Pisces and Mars in Cancer, and then the second part of Venus Mars story is also a trine, and yeah, and the third part is also a trine. When Venus is back in Aries, Mars will be in Leo. So
right.
yeah, there's something there about like interesting Venus and Mars dynamic going on in the
Mm,
skies, because I've been sort of like semi tracking that as sort of like some people's life, especially if you're super Venusian. You
yeah.
might want to look into that.
Yeah.
But then what I see right now is sort of like Venus is doing a lot of like integration with the other planet as well. It's like Venus is going to be conjunct Mercury,
Mm,
right? Which doesn't happen as much because they are both planets that are really close to the sun. I mean, they're the inner planets, right? And so Venus is going to conjunct Mercury in about like, yeah, around March 13, I think, something like that, right?
mm,
Um, and then Venus will do her own Kazemi thing, and then Venus will go back to like do something with the malefic with
Mm,
both Saturn and Mars.
yeah.
And I'm like, wow, that's a lot of things to pull as a
Yes.
For Venus. So it's like it's so interesting if you sometimes look at the planetary conversation in the skies. It's almost as if like, oh yeah, this planet is kind of like doing something with everyone. Kind of just like, all
Hmm.
right, and obviously, I'm trying not to forget about the moon. The moon is always circulating and going
Hmm.
around and kind of things like that. But yeah, there's something about Venus retrieving like some sort of like information from other planets, as well in through the series of conjunctions that we're gonna have. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's such a great point. And as you were speaking, I've also felt, I don't know if you found this to be true as well, Shahir, but Venus and Mars in prominent places, meaning like in signs where they're either exalted or fallen or domicile or in detriment, they always impact, at least for me, they always impact my lived experience in a really prominent way. Like there's something so corporeal about Venus and Mars. And,
Yeah.
it's very different than, say, like a Jupiter or a Saturn. Like the Jupiter Saturn square was challenging, right, earlier this year, but it kind of
Mhm.
felt more like challenging on a larger meta
Yeah.
existential
Yeah.
level,
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
like
It is.
yeah, whereas like Mars and Venus being in challenging or exciting position is like it you can feel it in your flesh, like quite
Yeah.
literally. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do believe that as well. I mean, if we're thinking about like besides, the moon, right? It's like, yeah, the moon is the filter of whatever planet, but like, yeah, we are on Earth and we are smacked between Venus and Mars,
Yes.
And so it's almost like those are the two like, the planetary gravities. So that will sort of like, yeah, they're around us, they're closer to us, and multiple ways as well. So yeah, definitely I've seen that transit to be super true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly with that sort of like feeling of the Venus and Mars. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And
Yeah.
I tend to have a lot of like Libra rising friends and
Mm.
Taurus rising people in my life too.
Mhm.
Maybe because I
Mhm.
have a Libra 11th house, and yeah, I'm
Mm.
always just like sometimes sometimes this is me to my friends. I'm just like, yeah, you're going through some things. And I'm like, and I'm not, and yeah, and that's the thing too, right? Because Venus and Mars has that, and compared to Saturn and Jupiter, like Jupiter and Saturn has a more like they have a more sextile relationship or even adverse relationship, right?
Mm.
But then Venus and Mars, they're like opposite each other. Like they always
Yeah.
control the opposite houses. So it's kind of like,
Mm. True.
the axis is always sort of like, yeah, it's the axis itself, right? It's sort of
Yeah.
like um and it's sort of like that Mercury Jupiter dynamic, but Mercury is because Mercury is really fast, and so like Mercury is kind of just like following the sun. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's why I think there's something about like the Venus and Mars is always very confronting and very felt on a deeper level too. Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
that's why, and that's why Venus retrograde has also become this sort of like thing where I love the this is the thing my I love when a concept becomes popular, and then I'm like, oh my god, now people are gonna be scared for whatever reason. It's like, oh my god, that's not helpful as much anymore, but also trying to be intimately real as well. That might also be the lived experiences for some folks of
Yeah.
confronting with the disappointments and
Yeah.
the interior part of desire,
Hmm.
and yeah, that's what I have, kind of
Yeah.
thinking about it.
Yeah.
What else is coming up? Is there anything else that's coming up for you?
No, I think that was really beautiful, Shahir. I really like what you said at the end there about confronting disappointment. And I suppose, as we're kind of winding to a close here, I'm curious if you have anything that you want to share with folks in terms of something to either reflect on, under this Venus retrograde, or um, yeah, ways to kind of ground themselves. Like if you have any sort of practice with Venus from your own practice or that you found to be helpful with clients, like what can we do? What can we the
Mm.
people do, as
Oh
we
my
move through
God.
this
Yeah.
transit? Yeah.
I it's sort of interesting because this sort of like people in the astrological magic sphere would always say that like yeah, like during Venus in retrograde, because it's the idea of like Inanna going to the underworld, kind of like the myth, right? So Venus
Yeah.
is dying. Um and yeah, so it's not a great time for you to be asking Venus anything, which is sort of like
Mm.
planetary sort of like idea kind of thing. But it doesn't mean that you can't do certain things on like Fridays, right? You might want to like dress up a bit, or just like really feel what feels good for you. Like I love Venus is the planet of devotion, and so it's like finding things that you are actually devoted to, right?
Mm.
Fundamentally, like be it music, be it dance, or something that really moves you and connects the different parts of you. So it's like, yeah, grounding always comes to the body kind of idea. That would be wonderful. And then kind of uh, adventuring into like a different sport, even if you prefer that,
Mm.
right? I recently went into like I did like pickleball recently. I was like, oh my God, I love this. It's almost a so doing things which are that is like intentional cultivation of joy
Mm.
true, and Aries is also the place of where there's a sense of adventure to it, right? There's a sense
Mm.
of like physicality to it that is required as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, just do those things that requires you to move a bit. um yeah, in order for you to like, yeah, because it's like because like whenever you were talking about like all we were talking about all the heavy like the interior things, but
Yeah.
then at the end of the day it's all about like, all right, yeah, like do things which are also good for your body.
Hmm.
um and yeah, I would advocate for that. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. That is so helpful. And yeah, I'm really excited to continue anchoring in and reflecting on so much of the richness that you share here, Shahir.
Oh my
This has
God,
been
thank
incredible.
you for
Yeah.
having me.
Of
Yeah, thank you.
course. Of course. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. I've really enjoyed receiving it, and it's such a gift to the podcast. In closing, I'm curious if there's any offerings or anything you want people to know about. Yeah, as a final
Yeah, I mean,
parting.
at the moment, I'm actually offering a Venus retrograde reading.
Ooh, exciting.
But it's asynchronous. I'm doing this. Yeah, this is just me. Like I was like channeling my Venus, like, what did this Venus want me to do with like some sort of offering?
Yeah.
I call it the three arches of
Mm.
Venus retrograde.
Mhm.
And it's actually in cumulatively it's like a 30 plus minutes audio transmission that will be tailored to your birth to a person's birth chart with this Venus retrograde. And yeah, I'm gonna be delivering it throughout this phase. So there's going to be three batches of it. So yeah,
Mhm.
if you're going through certain things like, and you feel like, oh my God, I need to prepare for a reading, or like you need a guide to like sort of like channel certain things for you.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. So it will come about right, right now until before Venus goes into invisibility. Um, Invisible mode. So now the first batch will be delivered. So it's still open. It's kind of just like, and then the second batch will then be around when Venus is sort of like in the week when Venus is sort of like Kazimi and like emerging from the skies after that. And then after that, it will be when she's sort of like emerging from the skies. And yeah, so it will sort of like I'm looking at the phase of like March, April, May. So like
Yeah.
the reading is meant to be like March, April, May kind of idea as well. So yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you.